He sold his daughter, but 2 months later he received the worst punishment. Santiago Galvin, a man of about 50, stared at the peeling walls of his small mechanic shop with the same feeling of defeat that had accompanied his days for years. The noise of the old cash register, almost always empty, and the echo of rusty tools he hardly used anymore seemed to remind him, day after day, of the failure of his efforts. Since he had opened the business more than a decade ago, he had always dreamed of prospering, of having something solid to offer his daughter. But life, mercilessly, had led him from stumble to stumble, leaving him in a desperate situation. Customers no longer came as they used to. The neighborhood had changed. The factories surrounding his shop had closed one after another, leaving the community without jobs and him without work. Debts piled up. Collection letters arrived weekly, and Santiago felt as if an invisible hand were pushing him into a dark abyss with no way out. His phone rang constantly, not with opportunities, but with veiled threats from those who no longer believed in his promises. Each call was a reminder that time was running out. That night, like so many others, he returned home after an unproductive day. The small dwelling, modest and almost devoid of furniture, now seemed too big, too empty. Yet, as he opened the door, he always found a reason to cling to a thread of hope. His 8-year-old daughter, Valentina. The girl welcomed him with a smile, as if her embrace could dissolve any worry. She ran to him, arms open and eyes shining with joy. "Daddy!" Valentina shouted excitedly, throwing herself into his arms. Santiago held her, and for a moment he allowed himself to smile, although that smile never reached his eyes. He couldn't help but think of how little he had to offer her. His daughter deserved much more than a life filled with hardships. Yet Valentina seemed unaware of it all. In her innocence, she saw only her father, her hero. That night, after dinner, which consisted of a few modest pieces of bread and cheese, Valentina nestled beside him on the old sofa they had inherited from her grandmother. Santiago was lost in thought, staring into space, as dark thoughts filled his mind. The bills, the money he didn't have, the crumbling shop. Sometimes he felt that the weight of his own existence was unbearable, and the only reason he kept trying was that little girl who now embraced him with such tenderness. "Daddy, why are you so sad?" Valentina asked softly, her voice full of concern. She looked at him with those big eyes, brimming with a compassion that almost disarmed him. It was hard to believe that such a young child could understand so much. Santiago sighed deeply. How could he explain the abyss of despair he found himself into an 8-year-old? How could he tell her that soon they might not even have a roof over their heads? "It's complicated, daughter," he murmured, avoiding her gaze. "Sometimes things don't go the way we hope." Valentina, always sensitive, held her father's hand and squeezed it firmly. "Don't worry, Daddy. I know everything will be all right," she said, her voice filled with an almost miraculous faith. Santiago felt a lump in his throat. At that moment, his daughter's innocence was both a consolation and a dagger in his heart, because he couldn't believe in that hope she offered him. How could he, when his world was falling apart with every step? What good is faith if we're in misery? Santiago muttered, unaware he was speaking aloud. Valentina looked at him, surprised, but didn't let go of his hand. Instead, her small palm gripped his even tighter, as if she could support him in that moment of weakness. "Daddy, faith is for when we're sad, isn't it? I know God hears us," she said with a certainty that made Santiago close his eyes, trying to hold back tears. Valentina always spoke of God, of how he cared and protected, but to Santiago, those words felt empty. Amid so much suffering, faith had been the first thing to shatter, leaving a void he didn't know how to fill. With a sigh, Santiago hugged Valentina, allowing the little girl's body to offer him some warmth amidst the darkness. As he stroked her hair, he wondered if he would ever be able to give her the life she deserved, a life free from hardship. But deep down, despair continued to throb, like a constant shadow waiting for the right moment to consume him completely. That night, when Valentina finally fell asleep, Santiago remained in the dimly lit room, his mind tormented by terrifying thoughts. He stared at the small pile of money he had left, pondering how long they could survive. The distant sounds of the city were his only companions during that long night. In his mind, it became increasingly difficult to see a way out. Feeling the weight of misery crushing him, Santiago muttered in the darkness, "How far will I have to go to get out of this?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, like a threatening shadow that seemed to herald a terrible decision. It was a muggy afternoon, and sweat trickled down Santiago's forehead as he walked through the city center, lost in thought. He was returning from yet another failed attempt to secure a bank loan to save his business. The bank manager hadn't even given him a chance to explain his situation. He had merely looked at the numbers and, with a cold, mechanical smile, denied any assistance. As he walked, head down, Santiago felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned, surprised, and found the familiar face of Ramiro, an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in years. Ramiro was a man of robust build with a cynical air that intimidated everyone. His past was surrounded by dark rumors. It was said he was a loan shark who didn't care about the methods he used to collect debts. "Santiago, my friend, long time no see," Ramiro exclaimed, with a smile that seemed more like a calculated expression of satisfaction than one of affection. Santiago hesitated, but greeted him with a weary nod. Ramiro wasn't someone he liked to associate with, but deep down, he felt a twinge of relief to see a familiar face amidst the whirlwind of his problems. Perhaps he could find a solution, any solution, in that unexpected encounter. Ramiro sensed his hesitation and gave him a pat on the back. "I hear things aren't going well for you, Santiago. It seems your business is, let's say, on its last legs." The comment was as sharp as a blade. Santiago's face tightened, but he didn't deny it. "Yes, things aren't easy," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Ramiro gave him a look that was a mix of pity and cunning. "You know, my friend, I can help. I always have one or two options for those who are willing to do whatever it takes." Santiago felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the kind of help Ramiro offered, but he was at a dead end, with debts growing ever more suffocating. For a moment, he thought of refusing and moving on, but curiosity, or perhaps desperation, made him stay. "And what kind of help would that be, Ramiro?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper, as if he feared hearing the answer. Ramiro smirked and lit a cigarette, taking a slow drag before replying. "Well, lately I've come across a certain high-level clientele, let's say. People with a lot of money, but with certain voids in their lives that money doesn't fill." He looked at Santiago, observing his reaction carefully before continuing. "It's a wealthy family, Santiago. No children. They'd be willing to pay a lot for a child to raise as their own. A sweet child, full of life, a child like your Valentina." Santiago froze. The proposal was so absurd, so grotesque, that for a moment he thought Ramiro was joking. He felt a wave of nausea rise and a tremor ran through his body. You must be joking, Ramiro," he whispered, incredulous. But Ramiro's expression was serious, almost impassive. "I'm not joking, Santiago," he said in a cold, calculated tone. "Think about it. This family has everything you could never offer. Your daughter would have a comfortable life, a top-notch education, nice clothes, a house full of toys. She'd never lack for anything." Santiago swallowed hard, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The idea was monstrous, yet something inside him began to waver. His mind, exhausted and dulled by the weight of debt and misery, struggled to reject the suggestion. And yet, he felt a voice whispering deep inside, reminding him that this could be the only way out. "I could never do that, Ramiro. She's my daughter," he stammered, almost as if trying to convince himself. Ramiro shrugged, but his eyes remained fixed on Santiago, like a predator that knows its prey is on the verge of surrender. "Think about it, Santiago. You're practically bankrupt. How many days do you think you have until you're evicted? Until your business closes for good? Until you have nothing left to feed your daughters?" Those words hit Santiago like a punch. He lowered his head, feeling shame and despair growing within him. He knew Ramiro wasn't a good man, but what he was offering was, in fact, a solution to all his problems. And Valentina could have a life he could never provide. "If you decide to accept," Ramiro continued with a terrifying calm, "the family is willing to pay enough for you to start over. Think about it, Santiago. You could pay off all your debts, fix your business, maybe even move to a city where no one knows your past." Santiago struggled against the impulse to walk away. He felt disgusted, yet the temptation began to take root in his mind. And Valentina? What would happen to her? He asked, his voice barely a whisper, ashamed even to be considering this conversation. "She'd be in good hands, Santiago. Influential people with power and money. They would treat her like the princess you always wanted her to be," Ramiro said, with a voice that seemed a mix of persuasion and disdain. "Deep down, you know you can't give her a life like that." Ramiro's words were like poison, seeping into Santiago's thoughts, contaminating his last reserves of dignity. He knew it was wrong, that he shouldn't even be considering such a thing. But as he looked down, the image of the empty house, the debts, the collection letters, seemed to crush him. I can't do that, Ramiro. She's my daughter," Santiago whispered, his voice choked, trying to find the strength to push away the monstrous idea eating away at his soul. Ramiro took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled the smoke slowly, never taking his eyes off Santiago. His face was a mask of calculated coldness, almost mocking. He didn't seem the least bit shaken by Santiago's resistance. On the contrary, it was as if he were expecting it, as if he knew every step of the internal struggle tearing the man before him apart. "I understand, Santiago. Of course, you don't want to do this. After all, you're a father, aren't you? You want the best for her. You want to see her grow up happy by your side, even if it means dragging her into this miserable life you lead. Even if it means seeing her suffer because of your choices, your limitations," Ramiro said, giving a cynical half-smile. Ramiro's words pierced Santiago's mind like sharp knives. Each phrase was a blow, a subtle accusation that made him feel even more powerless and desperate. What did he have to offer Valentina? A childhood filled with deprivations, an empty home, an uncertain future? For weeks, he had barely managed to put food on the table, and Valentina, though she never complained, was forced to eat portions that grew smaller by the day. Santiago shook his head, trying to drive away those thoughts. He knew Ramiro was manipulating his emotions, knew that man didn't have good intentions. But the voice of desperation inside him was loud, insistent. Valentina could have everything: toys, new clothes, a real school. He knew he'd never be able to provide her with that. "Santiago," Ramiro continued, lowering his voice as if sharing a dark secret, "I'm not asking you to sell your daughter to just anyone. I'm talking about a family that would give her a princess's life. She'd never have to go hungry, never have to see you struggling and wearing yourself down every day to pay the bills. She'd have an opportunity you'll never be able to offer. But I love her, Santiago whispered, as if this was the last truth he could cling to. She's all I have, and maybe that's exactly why you should think about what's best for her, Ramiro replied, with not a hint of pity in his gaze. Look at yourself, Santiago. You're done, bankrupt. You're not capable of giving her a decent life. Not now. Not ever. And as much as you love her, love doesn't fill a child's stomach. It doesn't pay for medicine when she's sick. Santiago closed his eyes, feeling suffocated. A wave of shame washed over him, and he hated himself for even listening to those words. But at the same time, the image of Valentina growing up in poverty, bearing the weight of her father's wrong choices, haunted him. He wanted to believe that if he kept trying, things would improve. But reality was cruel, relentless, and with each passing day, he sank deeper, dragging his daughter along with him. Ramiro took one last drag from his cigarette, then tossed it to the ground and crushed the tip with his boot, as if that was the final word in their conversation. Think carefully, Santiago. I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just giving you a way out, a chance to start over. If you decide that you want a better life for your daughter, and for yourself, you know where to find me. But don't delay. These opportunities don't stay available forever. And with that, Ramiro walked away, leaving Santiago standing in the middle of the street, consumed by the hellish dilemma now tormenting him. He wanted to run, to escape that thought, to erase those words from his mind. But at the same time, a seed of doubt had already been planted, slowly growing, invading his dreams, his hopes, and his love for Valentina. That night, when he returned home, Santiago found Valentina already asleep on the couch, hugging an old rag doll her mother had sewn long before she died. He watched her for a long moment, his eyes filling with guilt and despair. He was a father who loved his daughter, and that made the decision all the more painful. He wanted the best for her, but what did he have to offer? Ramiro's words kept echoing in his mind, like an insidious poison corroding his last fragments of dignity. In the darkness, Santiago knelt beside the couch and whispered, as if he were expecting an answer from the silence itself. God, what should I do? Show me a way. But the answer that came was absolute silence, deep, crushing. And in that absence of answers, the shadow of Ramiro's offer became even more present, a temptation consuming him little by little, each day. The days that followed were a silent torment for Santiago. Every time he looked at Valentina, his heart shattered a bit more. He tried to convince himself that it could never be an option, that he would never give his daughter to strangers. But with every new bill that arrived, with each meager meal they shared, the temptation Ramiro had whispered became harder to ignore. He spent sleepless nights sitting at Valentina's bedside, watching her sleep peacefully, unaware of the agony tearing her father apart. He knew she deserved more than he could give. Life had been so hard on the two of them, and each attempt to get back on his feet resulted in another failure. As the weight of debt crushed him, Santiago began to believe that perhaps the greatest act of love would be to let her go. Finally, on a gloomy evening, Santiago made the decision that would forever change their lives. Trembling and with tear-filled eyes, he dialed Ramiro's number. The sound of the line ringing seemed like the herald of a sentence that couldn't be undone. "Hello?" Ramiro's deep, impassive voice sounded on the other end. I accept," Santiago whispered, feeling the weight of the words sink him even further. I'll let Valentina go with them." On the other end, Santiago heard a muffled sound of satisfied laughter. "Good choice, Santiago. You're doing the right thing for her and for yourself." Ramiro continued, "Tomorrow afternoon, come to my office. Everything will be settled quickly." He hung up the phone feeling empty, as if he'd lost his soul. That night was one of the longest of his life. He spent the hours in silence, sitting on the couch, feeling the chill of darkness envelop him. Valentina slept in the room next door, unaware of the fate that awaited her. The next day, Santiago woke up early and tried to act as if it were just another ordinary day. He dressed Valentina in one of her best outfits, a blue dress she only wore on special occasions. She was excited, thinking they might go for an outing or visit someplace special. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Valentina asked as he helped fasten the little bows in her hair. Her eyes sparkled with joy, and Santiago felt a pang of guilt so deep that he almost collapsed. We're going to meet some important people," he replied, forcing a smile that never reached his eyes. "They're friends of Daddy's, and they want to meet you." Valentina smiled confidently and took his hand as they left the house. Santiago, however, felt his heart as heavy as a stone. With each step, he felt he was betraying his own daughter's trust, but guilt and despair had already become inseparable companions. He knew that once he took that step, there would be no going back. Upon arriving at Ramiro's office, Santiago held Valentina's hand more tightly. The place was cold and impersonal, with gray concrete walls and a dimly lit reception area. Ramiro was waiting, dressed in a dark suit, with a satisfied smile that made Santiago shrink inside. "Welcome," Ramiro said, gesturing for them to come closer. "Valentina, you're a very beautiful little girl. Did you know that?" he remarked with a false gentleness. Valentina, always shy around strangers, hid a little behind Santiago, clutching her father's hand. Santiago knelt beside his daughter and tried to smile at her, even though his chest felt shattered. "Don't worry, my love. These people are good. They'll take good care of you." Valentina looked at her father, confused but unsuspecting of the truth. She trusted him completely. "Are you coming with me too, Daddy?" The knot in Santiago's throat tightened. He wanted to say yes, that he'd never leave her, that he'd always be by her side. But instead, he simply shook his head slowly. "No, my dear. Daddy has to take care of a few things. But I'll always be with you. Right here," he said, pointing to her chest. "And you'll always be with me." Just then, the door opened, and an elegant couple entered. The woman, with her hair pulled back in a bun, wore expensive clothes and emanated a sweet, cloying perfume. The man, tall and silent, bore a serious, cold expression, as if this were just another transaction in his life. "Is this the little one?" the woman asked, casting an appraising glance at Valentina. Santiago nodded, struggling to keep his composure. Valentina looked at him, frightened, but didn't let go of his hand. The couple approached, and the woman extended her hand to Valentina, offering a fake smile. "Hello, dear. I'm Marta, and he's Eduardo. We're going to be your new friends." Valentina looked at her father, seeking reassurance, but Santiago avoided her gaze. The pain was unbearable. At that moment, he realized he was destroying everything he loved most in the world, but it was too late. He didn't have the strength to turn back. With a heavy heart, Santiago let go of Valentina's hand and took a step back. The girl, feeling the loss of contact, began to cry, looking at him with a gaze of despair he would never forget. "Daddy, why are you leaving me?" Valentina asked, her voice a whisper full of pain. Santiago tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He swallowed hard and lowered his head, feeling the tears roll down his face. There was no way to justify his actions, not to her and not to himself. "It'll be better for you, my daughter," he murmured, barely audible. I'm sorry." The couple held Valentina by the shoulders and began to lead her toward the exit. She looked back, her eyes filled with tears, trying to understand why her father was abandoning her. Every step she took was a blow to Santiago's heart. "Daddy, don't leave me," she cried, reaching out toward him. Santiago felt as if he were dying inside, but he remained still, too broken to intervene. He watched with his heart in pieces as the door closed, the last image being Valentina's face, marked by fear and confusion. When silence finally reigned, Ramiro approached Santiago, placing a thick envelope in his hands. "Here's what we agreed upon. I hope you get what you want with it," he said, devoid of any emotion. Santiago looked at the envelope, feeling the weight of the money in his hands. But the emptiness inside him was so vast that he could barely move. Mechanically, he put the envelope in his pocket and left the building, dragging his feet as if he were carrying his own corpse. Outside, the sky was gray, and rain began to fall slowly, as if the city itself were. Weeping with him, Santiago walked aimlessly through the streets, his mind numb, his heart shattered. With each step, guilt and regret gnawed at him, turning the money in his hands into an unbearable weight. He had committed the worst of crimes. He had betrayed his daughter's trust, abandoned the only person who gave him hope. In the days following Valentina's departure, Santiago tried to convince himself he had made the right decision. He repeated to himself, like a mantra, that she was now in a better place, with people who could give her everything he could never afford. But no matter how much he tried to deceive himself, the feeling of emptiness consumed him more each day. He used the money Ramiro had given him to pay off all his accumulated debts. He settled loans, paid the suppliers of the little that remained of the workshop, and still had enough left to start over, just as Ramiro had promised. He could finally sleep without being awakened by the nightmares of collectors or the fear of losing his roof. But, paradoxically, the peace he had hoped for never came. The nights were torturous. At first, he tried to distract himself with work, staying as busy as possible. He spent hours in the workshop, fixing engines and cleaning tools, even though there were no more customers. He felt like a ghost wandering among parts and screws that once had purpose, but now meant nothing. The house, once a refuge of love, was now enveloped in unbearable silence. Every corner, every object, every detail reminded him of Valentina. Her scent still lingered on the pillow in her small bedroom, and the marks of her little hands remained on the window glass. Santiago avoided going in there, but some nights, driven by a longing so deep it hurt physically, he would open the door and sit on the edge of the empty bed, breathing in her faint scent and imagining she was still there, sleeping, smiling. One night, as he wandered through the house in the middle of the night, Santiago heard a child's laughter in his mind, echoing through the empty walls. It was as if Valentina were there, running down the hallways as she used to, calling him to play. He closed his eyes, fighting back tears, but her voice seemed to grow louder, more real. "Why did you leave me, Daddy?" The words echoed in his mind like a distant lament, and Santiago felt tears sliding down his face. The image of Valentina looking at him with those frightened, confused eyes was a constant torment that haunted him even in his dreams. In his sleep, he relived the moment he let go of her hand and watched her being taken away. In each nightmare, the scene repeated itself, but this time she cried and screamed, begging him not to leave her. He would wake up with his heart racing, drenched in cold sweat, feeling a void that had become unbearable. One lonely afternoon, after weeks of torment, Santiago decided to visit the neighborhood church. He had lost his faith long ago, but something within him, perhaps the last spark of hope, led him there. He entered the empty church, feeling the echo of his footsteps reverberate through the silent hall. He sat on one of the wooden pews and remained silent, staring at the altar. "God," he whispered, his voice hoarse and trembling. If you're still there, I don't know what to do anymore." Santiago lowered his head, feeling guilt and regret boiling within him. "I only wanted what was best for her," he continued, his voice almost inaudible. "I thought I was saving my daughter, but now I see that I betrayed her. I gave her to strangers, and now I am empty. Nothing makes sense." No answer came. The church remained in a profound silence, and Santiago felt more abandoned than ever. The loneliness seemed to crush him, and he realized that not even here would he find relief. He rose with difficulty, his body heavy with exhaustion and pain, and left, feeling even more lost. Time passed, but the pain didn't lessen. On the contrary, the emptiness seemed to grow within him, consuming everything in his life. He lost interest in work, barely ate, barely slept. The people around him began to notice his change. The grocer, the neighborhood butcher, even the few clients who still showed up. But Santiago isolated himself more and more, unable to face others, unable to face himself. Every time he looked at the money that remained, he felt a mixture of hatred and disgust. What had once represented a possible salvation was now a symbol of his guilt. He even hid the envelope at the bottom of a drawer, but it didn't help. Even without seeing it, he knew it was there, like a mark of the betrayal he had committed against his own daughter. In the middle of yet another sleepless night, Santiago felt something break inside him. He got up and went to Valentina's room. Sitting on her bed, he buried his face in his hands and cried as he had never cried before. The weight of guilt felt beyond his ability to bear. In the midst of his sobbing, he whispered, "Valentina, forgive me. I was a weak man. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now I know I failed you in every possible way." He ran his fingers over her pillow, trying to capture some of her presence. Everything felt lost, and he sensed that his heart had shattered in a way that could never be repaired. From that moment on, Santiago began to lose touch with reality. He couldn't distinguish night from day, and guilt gnawed at him like a disease. The small amount of money left in the envelope began to disappear, consumed by alcohol and other vices he used to try to numb the pain. Each drink, each fleeting distraction, was a vain attempt to fill the emptiness Valentina had left behind. But her voice, in his mind, never disappeared. Every night was a return to torture, a repetition of the same nightmare where he saw her leaving, always with tearful eyes, always asking, "Why did you leave me, Daddy?" One morning, Santiago woke up lying on the living room floor, with sunlight filtering through the window, illuminating the chaos his life had become. The crushing weight of guilt and regret felt like an anchor pulling him deeper into his own misery. As he staggered to his feet, vision blurred, Santiago came to a bitter realization. The money would never bring him peace. It would never make up for the loss of his daughter, never be enough to erase the mistake he had made. 2 months had passed since Santiago made the decision that had ruined his life. The money, which he had once believed would be his salvation, was now a bitter reminder of his betrayal. His deteriorated appearance and erratic behavior soon drew the attention of the few who still cared about him. He avoided all interaction, spending his days in a dark haze, as if the world around him had lost its colors and sounds. Then, on a cold, overcast morning, reality confronted him in a brutal way. Santiago was sitting at the small kitchen table, staring at the bottom of a mug of cold coffee, when the phone rang. The sound was almost deafening in the silence of the house. Santiago hesitated before answering. Since Valentina's departure, he had avoided phone calls, fearing they might bring reminders of the life he'd lost. Yet something compelled him to pick up the phone. "Hello." His voice was hoarse, nearly unrecognizable. On the other end, a cold, impersonal voice replied, Mr. Santiago Galvin? Yes, who is this? He asked, intrigued. I'm Investigator Morales, from the Crimes Against Minors Department, said the voice, without preamble. Santiago felt a chill run down his spine, and fear gripped his chest. We need you to come to the station as soon as possible. It's about your daughter, Valentina. Hearing his daughter's name, Santiago's heart raced. My daughter? Well, what happened to her? He asked, his voice trembling. The response was quick and impassive. It's better if we speak in person, Mr. Galvin. We'll be expecting you. Before Santiago could ask more, the line went dead. He stood there for a few seconds, trying to process what he had just heard. The mention of Valentina's name mingled with a growing dread. What did the police want? Why were they talking about her now? After all this time? Without wasting another moment, Santiago threw on his worn coat and left the house, his hands trembling and his mind clouded by dark thoughts. He felt as though he were walking toward a terrible fate, one he himself had sealed with his choice. The streets seemed endless as he walked toward the station, the weight of guilt crushing him even more with each step. Upon arrival, he was met by Investigator Morales, a middle-aged man with a tired expression and a hardened look. Mr. Galvin, thank you for coming. Could we talk in a private room? The officer asked, gesturing toward a nearby door. Santiago nodded silently and followed the investigator. He sat in an uncomfortable chair as Morales looked at him with an almost relentless seriousness. Santiago felt a knot tightening in his throat, his eyes desperate for answers. Where is my daughter? Was the first question he managed to ask. Morales took a deep breath before answering, as if preparing his spirit for the weight of the words he was about to say. Mr. Galvin, I think you need to know the whole truth. Though I must tell you that what I have to share won't be easy to hear. Santiago clenched his fists on his knees, feeling fear flood his chest like an uncontrollable tide. Tell me, just tell me, he murmured. The couple who bought your daughter was arrested last week during an operation against human trafficking. They're being accused of heinous crimes involving the exploitation of minors. I can't go into specific details, but they weren't who they claimed to be. The words hit Santiago like a punch. His vision darkened momentarily, and he had to brace himself on the chair to keep from falling. Everything around him seemed to spin as he tried to absorb what he had just heard. What did they do to my daughter? He asked, his voice barely audible. Morales averted his gaze, and the hardness in his face softened for a moment, revealing a trace of compassion. Unfortunately, Mr. Galvin, we don't know exactly where she is. During the operation, we found evidence that she was taken out of the city shortly after she was handed over to the couple. They were involved with a criminal network, and Valentina, well, we haven't been able to locate her yet. Santiago put his hands over his face, feeling despair and guilt suffocate him. No, this can't be happening, he whispered, shaking his head. The thought that Valentina might be in even more dangerous hands than he had imagined was a living nightmare, a reality his heart refused to accept. I know this is a lot to process, Morales said, his tone softer, almost paternal. But the truth is, the situation is serious. We're already in contact with other units and international forces to try to locate the network the couple was associated with. I believe there's still a chance of finding your daughter. But time is our greatest enemy. Santiago barely registered what the officer was saying. With each word, he felt himself sinking deeper into a well of despair. The memory of Valentina's face, the fear in her eyes, her voice whispering, "Why did you leave me, Daddy?" became a blade slicing through his chest. All of this is my fault, he murmured, his voice laden with unbearable pain. I handed her over to them. I betrayed her, abandoned my own daughter. Morales remained silent, respecting Santiago's grief and regret. After a few moments, he spoke. You made a terrible choice, Mr. Galvin, and now you're living with its consequences. But if you truly want to do something for your daughter, you must cling to hope. It's not too late to try to find her." Santiago shook his head, feeling utterly helpless. The officer's voice seemed distant, as though coming from an unreachable place. Guilt and remorse had now become a prison, a sentence he would never escape. Santiago could barely breathe at the thought that Valentina might be somewhere, suffering, calling out for him, and he powerless, unable to rescue her. As he left the police station, Santiago wandered the streets, lost in dark thoughts. The revelation was unbearable. Now, in addition to the guilt of betraying her, he carried the weight of knowing he had placed her in the hands of monsters. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground beneath him were made of quicksand, pulling him deeper and deeper. Back at home, he sat on the couch, staring into the emptiness. All he had left now were memories of Valentina, her smile, her sweet voice, and her words filled with trust and unconditional love. Santiago had destroyed everything, and now he felt he would never have the chance to make amends. The silence in the house felt denser than ever, suffocating. Santiago looked around, seeking a shred of comfort, but all he found was the echo of his own mistakes. He closed his eyes, feeling tears stream down his face. He didn't know if there was still a path to follow, any hope of rescuing his daughter. But in that moment, one thing was clear. He would never be able to forgive himself. After receiving the devastating news about Valentina's disappearance, Santiago fell into an even deeper spiral of despair. Each day was an endless torment. Guilt consumed him, and the image of his daughter, lost somewhere unknown, possibly in danger, tormented his mind constantly. There was no peace, no rest. The faint hope that still existed in his heart pushed him to keep going, to do something, anything, to find Valentina. The following morning, Santiago returned to the police station. He demanded, nearly begged for more information, any clue that might guide him. Investigator Morales received him, trying to calm him, but there was little he could do. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Galvin," Morales said, his tone patient but firm. "But cases like this, well, they take time. There are many routes, networks involved. Every move is calculated." "Time? I don't have time. My daughter is somewhere with those monsters." Santiago cried, his voice choked. "Please, Morales, she's all I have." Morales sighed, visibly moved by Santiago's suffering, but he maintained a professional stance. "I know you're going through something terrible, Mr. Galvin, but our team is in contact with other departments and organizations. These cases are complicated, but we won't give up. Now, please trust us to do our work." But these words did little to calm Santiago. He left the station with an even heavier heart. He couldn't simply wait for the police to solve everything. He had to act, had to find Valentina himself. With this in mind, he began a desperate search. Santiago started visiting all the areas of the city rumored to be involved in human trafficking or suspicious activities. He roamed through the darkest parts, talking to anyone who might have seen something, anyone who could give him a clue. He visited decayed neighborhoods, questioned residents, and even approached homeless people on the streets, always with a picture of Valentina in hand. "Have you seen this girl? Her name is Valentina. Please, she's my daughter," he pleaded, showing the photo. Some people shook their heads sympathetically, while others ignored him, bothered by the presence of this desperate man. Santiago didn't care. He continued, day after day, night after night, without rest. One night, exhausted and with his clothes covered in dust and dirt, Santiago entered a church. There were few people praying in silence. He knelt in a back pew and, for the first time in a long time, let out a sigh of surrender. "God, if you still hear me," He began, his voice broken. I made a terrible mistake. I was weak. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now my daughter, my Valentina, is lost. Please, if there's still a way for her, if there's still a chance, help me find her." He closed his eyes, feeling the tears slide down his face. There was no answer, only silence, and Santiago felt more alone than ever. But in that moment of despair, a memory surfaced. Valentina, with her pure and innocent smile, always reminding him, "God hears us, Daddy," whenever we talk to him. Even without an immediate answer, Santiago felt compelled to continue. He rose, wiped his tears, and left the church determined to keep searching. He knew he wasn't worthy of redemption, but he at least wanted the chance to save his daughter or die trying. In his search, he met people from all walks of life and intentions. One afternoon, while wandering through a dangerous neighborhood market, he heard rumors that a trafficking network operated in the area. Santiago approached some street vendors, trying to gather more information. Some looked at him with suspicion, but he persisted until one of the vendors, a man named Ernesto, took pity on his story. "Look, I've seen a lot around here, sir," Ernesto said in a low voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "If these people really took your daughter, it's too dangerous. They don't like anyone asking questions." "Please, Ernesto," Santiago whispered, desperate. "I don't care about the danger. She's my daughter. If you know anything at all, I need to know." Ernesto remained silent for a moment, visibly uncomfortable, but the sincerity and pain in Santiago's eyes convinced him. "They say they moved the children out of the city, towards the coast. From there, they're shipped to different destinations. Some say they're taken abroad, never to return." Ernesto's words made Santiago's blood run cold. The thought of Valentina being taken to some unknown place, possibly never to return, left him breathless. But he couldn't let fear take over now. He thanked Ernesto and set off immediately toward the coast, determined to follow any lead, no matter how small. Santiago spent weeks moving from town to town along the coast, visiting small ports, talking to fishermen and sailors. Over time, his appearance deteriorated further. Unshaven, gaunt, with hollow eyes. He was only a shadow of the man he had once been. He slept little, ate barely anything, living solely on the hope of finding some clue about his daughter. The remaining money in the envelope was running out, and he was forced to beg on some occasions, something that filled him with shame but was unavoidable. Some people offered him alms, while others looked at him with disdain, but Santiago accepted any help. Nothing else mattered to him. Valentina was his only reason for living, and every second away from her weighed more heavily on his heart. One of those nights, with no place to sleep, Santiago found shelter on a bench in a park. Before closing his eyes, he looked up at the starry sky and whispered, as he did every night, "Valentina, forgive me. Daddy is trying. I'm trying my daughter." At dawn, he rose and continued his search, barely able to support himself. With each town he passed, his body weakened, but his determination remained intact. However, the lack of leads began to take a toll. The hope that kept him moving was fading, and he felt that soon he would no longer have the strength to continue. Then, one night, while seeking shelter in a bus station, Santiago found a small reprieve from his solitude. A woman named Rosa, a volunteer at a shelter for rescued children, noticed his pitiful state and approached to offer help. After hearing his story, she was deeply moved. "Sir, maybe I can help," Rosa said, gently touching his shoulder. "Recently, a little girl arrived at the shelter where I work. She was malnourished, traumatized, and we don't know much about her family." Santiago felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He tried to contain his excitement, as he had already endured many false hopes, but something in Rosa's tone, something in her kind gaze, gave him an inexplicable certainty. "This girl, please, take me to her," he pleaded, his voice trembling. Rosa agreed and led him to the shelter, a modest but welcoming place where children who had experienced terrible situations were received and cared for. As they walked through the halls, Santiago's heart raced, caught between hope and fear. What if it wasn't Valentina? What if it was just another disappointment? But as they turned a corner and looked into a small room where children were playing, he saw her. There was Valentina sitting in a corner, hugging an old doll. She looked visibly thin and tired, her hair a bit tangled, her eyes downcast. She seemed like a fragile bird, as if she had lost all the energy she once radiated. "Valentina," Santiago whispered, his voice thick with emotion, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. Upon hearing the familiar whisper, the girl lifted her head, and her eyes met her father's. For a moment, she hesitated, as if trying to remember who this man was. But then, recognition returned to her gaze, and she stood up, running toward him. "Daddy!" Valentina cried, throwing herself into his arms. Santiago held her tightly to his chest, feeling tears stream freely down his face. He clung to her as if he would never let her go again, sobbing with relief and regret. I thought I'd never see you again," Valentina sobbed, clutching his neck. "I thought so too, my daughter, forgive me for everything. I'll never leave you again," Santiago promised, his voice breaking. In that embrace, Santiago found the redemption he had so desperately sought, and he knew that, despite all the suffering, he still had one last chance to rebuild his life alongside his daughter. The days following his reunion with Valentina were a mixture of joy and sorrow for Santiago. He brought her home, and every moment with her was a blessing. Yet, the guilt for what he had done still weighed on his heart, like a shadow that threatened to darken even the happiest moments. Valentina, though happy to be with her father, bore the scars of everything she had endured. She was a different child, more withdrawn, with a distant look, and sometimes Santiago would catch her watching him with a blend of love and caution, as if afraid of being abandoned again. Santiago knew that having her back wasn't enough. He needed to do something to truly earn his daughter's forgiveness, and more importantly, to forgive himself. He had to rebuild not only the trust between them, but also his own life. And the best way he found to start this process was by volunteering at the shelter where Valentina had been found. There, he could repay the help he had received and, at the same time, try to make amends for the harm he had caused. He sought out Rosa, the volunteer who had helped him find Valentina. Humbly, he asked if he could help at the shelter, even though he had no experience. Seeing the sincerity in his eyes, Rosa accepted immediately. "There's always work to be done here, Santiago. And believe me, your story could be a valuable lesson for these children and other parents," she said with a welcoming smile. Valentina began accompanying him on visits to the shelter. Santiago did whatever he could, cleaning, organizing toys, helping with meals, and above all, talking to the children, many of whom had experienced abandonment, neglect, and even violence. In each suffering face he saw, Santiago saw a piece of his own guilt. And at the same time, by helping and listening to these children, he felt that a part of his wounded soul was also healing. One afternoon, while Valentina played with other children in the yard, Santiago approached Rosa, watching his daughter from a distance. "Sometimes I think I'll never be able to make up for what I did," he said softly. "I feel like she'll never completely trust me again." Rosa placed her hand on his shoulder. "Trust is a delicate thing, Santiago, but love is much stronger. Your daughter is here with you, by your side, because she wants to be. She may not understand everything that happened, but she knows you've changed. Now, Only time can heal the wounds. Santiago nodded, absorbing Rose's words. He looked over at Valentina, who at that moment seemed to be smiling for the first time in weeks. That sight sparked a new flame of hope in his heart. He knew he could never erase what he had done, but he could build something new and meaningful from there. Over time, Santiago began giving talks in schools and community centers, sharing his story, exposing his mistakes, and warning other parents and families about the dangers and importance of not succumbing to despair. He held nothing back, revealing the whole truth, the suffering, the regret, and the pain of almost losing what he loved most. It was a painful process, but a necessary one. And each time he finished a talk and saw the emotional expressions of the audience, he felt he was slowly finding redemption. Valentina accompanied him whenever she could, and over time, she began to understand the sacrifice her father was making. One afternoon, on the way home from a talk, Santiago noticed that she was quieter than usual. Finally, she broke the silence. "Daddy, you tell everyone what you did wrong, why?" Valentina asked, looking at him with curiosity and a hint of sadness. Santiago sighed and stopped, kneeling to be at her level. "Because, my love, I need to show people that despair can lead us to make terrible mistakes, but also that it's possible to seek redemption. And more than that, I need to do it for you. I need to show you that true love never gives up, even when it seems impossible." Valentina looked into her father's eyes, taking in every word. Then, without a word, she hugged him tightly. In that embrace, Santiago felt something he had longed for, a silent forgiveness and the unconditional love of his daughter. That hug was a relief, as if an invisible chain had broken, allowing him to breathe freely for the first time. That night, Santiago went with Valentina to the church. He was not a man of faith, not like her, but seeing his daughter praying, her eyes closed, hands clasped in fervor, he felt something greater happening within him. He felt that maybe there was a second chance for him too. They say God gives us another chance when we truly repent, he whispered to Valentina as they left the church. "He gave us one, Daddy," Valentina replied with a serene smile. "He gave me back to you." Those words echoed in Santiago's heart, and at that moment, he knew his journey of redemption was just beginning. He would dedicate the rest of his life not only to Valentina, but also to helping those who, like him, had lost hope. He became actively involved with the shelter, helping other children find safe homes and ensuring that more families wouldn't face the same suffering he and Valentina had endured. Over time, his faith rebuilt itself, but in a different way, deeper and quieter. It wasn't blind faith, but one born of pain and the understanding of his own mistakes. Peace slowly returned to his life, and he began to find purpose in every small action, in every child he helped, in every embrace from Valentina. Years later, with Valentina grown and possessing a strength of spirit that filled him with pride, Santiago understood the true value of redemption. The pain would never be forgotten, and the scars of the past remained, but he now saw them as reminders of a second chance. He knew he would never be perfect, but he also knew he was doing his best every day. One day, as they walked together, Valentina took his hand and said, "Daddy, you taught me that people can change. I love you so much, and I know that, despite everything, you're the best father in the world." Santiago smiled, tears in his eyes, and squeezed her hand. "And you are the greatest gift God could give me, my daughter. Thank you for never giving up on me." The sun set on the horizon, bathing father and daughter in golden light. They walked hand in hand, knowing that despite the shadows of the past, they could now build a future of love and hope together. Sometimes, despair blinds us, leading us to make impulsive decisions that distance us from what truly matters. Santiago, in his deepest anguish, believed he was saving his daughter by giving her up for a better life, but in truth, he was surrendering himself to the darkness of guilt and regret. His story is a powerful testament that even in the darkest moments, redemption is possible. But it requires courage, true repentance, and an unrelenting pursuit of making amends. There is no easy path to forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness. Santiago only found peace by confronting his mistakes and dedicating his life to a purpose greater than his own troubles. The love of his daughter, Valentina, was the beacon that guided him back to the light. And, despite the wounds and scars they both carried, it was also love that allowed them to rebuild a relationship based on trust and mutual understanding, stronger than any mistake from the past. This story reminds us that true wealth isn't in money, but in love and connection with those we cherish. Material possessions may tempt us in moments of despair, but nothing is more valuable than love, family, and integrity. Above all, it teaches us that true forgiveness, genuine, lasting forgiveness, is a difficult road filled with obstacles. There is no magic solution to regret, but for those willing to face the pain of their mistakes and seek a life of meaning, redemption is possible. Santiago was given a second chance with Valentina. He finally understood that true faith resides in love, sacrifice, and devotion. With this understanding, he dedicated his life to preventing others from making the same mistakes, so that other parents wouldn't have to suffer as he had. The final message is clear. There is always a way back, even when it seems impossible. But it's a path that demands honesty, humility, and above all, a heart willing to change. And those scars remain. They can transform into reminders of valuable lessons. A reminder that no matter how painful the journey, love and true repentance can bring us peace. True wealth lies in the ability to love, forgive, and transform, no matter how deep the mistake. That is the lesson Santiago and Valentina leave us. A lesson of redemption, love, and hope for all those seeking a new beginning. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.